the more I learn about Smith, the more I'm blown away about his brilliance. It's just it's kind of an amazing thing that every generation or so, there are those who see things that aren't necessarily obvious. And what has sparked my interest of late is looking or reading about Smith's focus on education, that education should not be treated as a commodity, that it should be the obligation of the government to be providing workers education, because one, the specialization of labor could turn people into robots. It could dull the senses. But even more amazing was what I read concerning his notion about the importance of a population, since the majority of people are workers, that the importance of the workers having the moral education and the vision in order to pressure the leaders to pass laws that were for the common good. And I'm sure you know Fier and the press.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part, Ben.
But it's amazing to see that Pablo Fier, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Oh, yeah.
Are you familiar?
Mhm.
So, you know, Pablo Fier is talking about educating people to know the reality of their circumstances, that education should be very liberal. It should awaken people in the capacity for creative thinking, critical thinking. So Fier's critiquing the kind of banking education where students come in and the teacher knows all of the answers and is depositing that information into a student's head, basically indoctrinating and creating students that know how to follow instructions and obey authority. So I don't know if you know much more about Smith's views on both pedagogy as well as the role of education in a harmonious or prosperous society.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, which was Smith was very concerned about the impacts of division of labor on a worker's well-being, not just their physical well-being. I mean, you can think of the stresses of repetitive motion disease, but more importantly on their psychological well-being, where they're just turning a bolt. And we can think of the famous movie Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin, you know, where he's trying to turn a little bolt and that's all he does. And it's dehumanizing. And Smith said it's dehumanizing, and you're going to destroy the human being in the process of creating greater wealth. And that was a real concern of Adam Smith about the industrialization process. And that's why he was very concerned that workers have access to education as a way to enliven their minds. And he thought that it was the job of government to help create, I'm going to call it civic virtue. We need to have citizens who can be part of the democratic process, who can be working and engaged with a social private partnership to create a better world. And so he really did want to have some amount of government intervention to help workers overcome the problem, the deadening effects of industrialization. So yeah, that's a really good point that you're raising.
And frequently in meetings by non-economists and is it Smithiites? What are people who study?
Smith scholars.
Okay. People who aren't Smith scholars frequently reduce Adam Smith's invisible to a magical system where market forces of supply and demand and competition will self-regulate itself through the magic of competition. And I have read from you that you have a very different version of what Adam Smith meant by the invisible hand when he used it.
Yeah, thank you. So that second quote that you read at the start of the thing addresses laissez-faire. And Adam Smith was a fan of limited government because at the time he was writing, government had a very heavy hand on determining who the winners and the losers were going to be. And Adam Smith was opposed to that. He thought that it was unfair to the working poor in particular, that if the government grants monopoly power to just a few, that's very unfair to everybody else. So Smith's concern was that the heavy government hand would be pressing the scales of justice in the favor of elites and against the masses. And he was very much against that. So that's why he wanted to lift the hand of government out of the marketplace. But that's not to say he was in favor of laissez-faire, which is a word that comes out of France, let it be, from Francois Quesnay, who was a reformer in France. And Quesnay was an idealist who wanted no government and thought that any government intervention would be bad. And Smith liked a lot of what Quesnay had to say, but in The Wealth of Nations, he specifically singles him out and says why he thinks Quesnay is wrong, because Smith, believe it or not, despite all of his idealistic rhetoric, at the bottom line, Smith is a pragmatist. Smith wants to know what works. And he doesn't think that idealistic views tend to work that well. So for example, Quesnay was a doctor. And so Smith and The Wealth of Nations talk about it. What would you think if you went to a doctor who said, it doesn't matter what your ailment is, here's a precise regimen of diet and treatments that I'm going to give you, regardless of what your disease was. And you would say, that seems a little strange to me. I'd much rather have a pragmatist, somebody who would deal with me and what my situation is, rather than just some idealized version of things. And so Smith says, you know, the average person can do pretty well, even if the interventions aren't perfect. And so Smith was not in favor of laissez-faire. How do we know that? Well, read The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations is filled with interventions, such as the one we've already mentioned about education. But I'll give you another big one that'll blow your head away. We think that Smith is the father of modern economics, the father of modern capitalism. But Smith, believe it or not, did not trust financial markets to allocate capital efficiently. This is bizarre. The founder of capitalism didn't trust financial markets. Why? Because he thought they took too many risks. And therefore, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith basically comes up with a policy intervention that says government should set the rate of interest below the equilibrium rate of interest. And every student of Econ 101 would know if you set a price ceiling that's below equilibrium, you will create a shortage. In this case, you're creating a shortage of loanable funds. So if the government says bankers can't charge, suppose the equilibrium rate of interest is 8%, and Smith's saying the maximum you can charge is 5%, then everybody would know there's going to be a shortage at 5%. There are going to be more people applying to borrow than there are people willing to lend at 5%. And Smith wants to create a shortage. Why? Because he says bankers are then going to allocate scarce funds based on the stability of the borrower. And they're not going to make rash investments. If they can only earn 5%, they're not going to lend to the speculator. They're going to lend money to the person who has a solid business plan, has experience in the market, et cetera. But if you let the rate go up to 8%, there'll be a lot of, the only people who can pay 8% are those people who are making wild investments. And so here is Smith, the founder of economics, saying he wants to intervene in financial markets to limit risk by creating a shortage and using a form of rationing based on favoritism, based on we're going to lend only to people who are solid citizens and not speculators or gamblers in the marketplace. So this is one of many different kinds of interventions in the marketplace that Smith favored, even though he generally wanted a light hand of government.
And how did, another thing that impressed me about Smith was his writing about habits. I'm talking about stratification of society, and that where your place in a stratified society or your specialization tends to be from habit, not from talent or
Yes.
ability. So what did he mean by the term habit, and how would that fit into contemporary notions of Adam Smith?
Thank you. That's a great point that you're raising. And what he meant basically is that he was an egalitarian. He didn't think there was that much difference in terms of raw human power between a philosopher and a king and the peasant who's sunning himself by the side of the road. You know, Smith didn't think there was all that much difference between us in that regard. But what does distinguish us is our experience, and how experience can shape us. And therefore, there might be the difference between a philosopher and a pauper is that a philosopher has years of training and years of experience, whereas the pauper has not had that same experience. But in terms of raw natural talent, Smith does not think that there are great differences between human beings. And as a consequence of that, he's an egalitarian. He doesn't think that some people are on top because they're so much smarter or better than other people. He thinks some people are on top because it's just the way the dice rolled of what their experiences in life were, who their parents happen to be, and so on.
That
So our habits are determined by our experiences.
Yeah, and I understood it to be you're born into role, social roles, and those roles are hereditary. So my understanding of Smith is there's a lot about one of the issues with the market is that not everybody's starting from the same line in the race.
Yes, so you are correct that in Smith's time, there was not a lot of social mobility. And one bit of evidence that Smith would be in favor of more social mobility is his stand on primogeniture. Primogeniture is the habit and the custom of inheritance in Western Europe, in which only the eldest male son inherited everything. And if you happen to be the second son, sorry, you had to go into the priesthood or you had to go into the army. And if you were the daughter, you had to be married off to somebody who hopefully had some money. And the reason that society adopted primogeniture, according to Adam Smith, was to solve a problem of social stability during times of war. So if your nation is at war with invaders and the king dies, you want to be able to have a known ahead of time line of command, chain of command, so that if the king dies, everybody knows who's going to take control of the army, and that person is inheriting all the wealth of the king so that they'll be able to raise an army and maintain the stability and fight off invaders. And that was a very huge mandate for hundreds of years. But in Smith's age, he thinks that it had way outlived its usefulness. And Smith was in favor of doing away with primogeniture because there's no guarantee that the oldest son is going to be the most talented son. And all of those women who are the daughters might equally be very talented, and yet they're not being given a chance. So that's an example of Smith's egalitarianism in terms of his policy making. He wanted to eliminate primogeniture.